August 1943. The Pacific War has entered a phase the men in uniform will later call the season of attrition. A slow, grinding struggle where the tropical heat, disease, and endless Japanese resistance carve away at American strength just as ruthlessly as bullets. In the Solomon Islands, the sky has become a graveyard suspended over shattered jungles and burning coastlines. Every morning begins with the uneasy silence of an airfield where too many planes failed to return the day before. Every night ends with the echo of distant engines, followed by the dread-laced question every pilot asks himself: will I be next? This is the world into which a strange, mismatched unit is about to be born. The U.S. Marine Corps desperately needs fighters in the air. Squadrons are understrength, replacements are scarce, and the Japanese still dominate pockets of the sky with veteran Zero pilots hardened from years of combat in China and the early Pacific conquests. Guadalcanal has been won, but at a cost measured in blood and broken steel. The front has moved north, toward the airfields of Baracoma and Munda, where the smell of gasoline, salt, and rot merges into a single reminder: survival here is a privilege, not a promise. The Marine Corps solution is as bold as it is risky. Form a new fighter squadron from the leftovers. Pilots transferred from other units. Fresh faces with barely enough hours to call themselves aviators. Men recovering from wounds, disciplinary issues, personal demons. The kind of group that would make traditional commanders shake their heads and mutter that this is no way to win a war. But war doesn't ask for perfect men. It asks for available ones. And on these islands, even the imperfect become necessary. They will be designated VMF 214, but the name means nothing yet. History has not touched them. The men themselves don't know they are about to create a legend that will echo through aviation history for decades to come. At this moment, they are just names on a roster, standing in loose formation under the heavy Pacific sun, sweat rolling down their backs as they wait for the commanding officer they've only heard rumors about. This is where the myth begins, with uncertainty, exhaustion, and the grim awareness that most new pilots last only a few missions before the Pacific claims them. The emotional weight on these young men is immense. Some have seen combat, others haven't. Some still believe war is a place where heroes are made, others already know it's a place where heroes die. Yet they all share one thing: a desire to fight back against an enemy that feels unstoppable. In the Solomon Islands, the Japanese are not an abstract threat. They are the pilots who shot down your bunkmate, the silhouettes that appeared out of the sun and ripped through your formation, the ghosts you see when you close your eyes at night. Their aircraft, the F4U Corsair, is powerful but unpredictable. A monster of a machine with a massive engine up front and wings bent like a predatory bird. It promises speed, climb, and killing power, if you can master it. Many squadrons can't. Some flat out refuse to fly it. But this new squadron doesn't get to choose. They will fly whatever they are given. Because in 1943, the U.S. cannot afford to waste any tool that gives even the slightest edge in the air. The Corsair becomes a symbol of their own identity. Flawed, intimidating, and underestimated. As the squadron begins assembling at the primitive airstrips carved out of the jungle, they find themselves surrounded by reminders of the men who came before them. Wrecked aircraft pushed to the side of the runway, half buried, propellers and makeshift crosses marking pilots who never made it back. The mechanics work knee-deep in mud, fighting off mosquitoes the size of bullets. Supply officers ration everything from machine gun belts to drinkable water. Even sleep becomes a luxury, interrupted by the drone of enemy patrols or the sudden wail of air raid sirens. But it is in this crucible that the Black Sheep will be formed, not from pride or tradition, but from necessity and raw determination. The pilots quickly realize that they are entering a world where the line between life and death is measured in seconds. Veteran aviators tell them that the first 2 missions are the most dangerous. After that, a man either adapts or he never returns. The new squadron members watch other units prepare for sorties, observing the haunted looks of pilots who have tasted the vicious, swirling chaos of a dogfight over the Pacific. They hear the stories. Zeros diving out of the sun, pilots blacking out under G-forces, airframes torn apart by Japanese cannon fire. Fear becomes a constant companion, but so does adrenaline. Beneath the fear lies something else: resolve. Because while command may see them as replacements, the pilots themselves know they are stepping into the shoes of men who carried the weight of the entire Pacific campaign. There is a legacy here, carved into the muddy runways and rusted fuel drums. A legacy they will either add to or die trying. And then comes the whispers, rumors of the man chosen to lead them. A veteran, a troublemaker, a pilot with scars no uniform can hide. A man who flew with the Flying Tigers and carries a shadow around him like a cloak. Some say he's reckless, others say he's brilliant. All agree he's dangerous. His name is Major Gregory Pappy Boyington. The men don't know much about him yet, but they sense that his arrival will shift the atmosphere instantly, that this squadron, this collection of misfits and replacements, might actually stand a chance with the right kind of leader. Or the wrong kind, depending on who you ask. Boyington is a puzzle wrapped in contradictions, and soon he will become the force that binds this uncertain group into a single, lethal unit. For now, the men wait. The skies above the Solomons burn with the same mix of beauty and terror they will soon face. The air hums with distant engines. The horizon flickers with flashes of artillery. And in this moment suspended between dread and destiny, the future Black Sheep stand on the edge of history, unaware that they will soon become one of the most legendary squadrons in the entire Pacific War. But before this unlikely squadron can rise, we must step into the world of the man who would lead them, a man whose own battles began long before he ever set foot on Pacific soil. Gregory Boyington was never meant to fit inside the clean, polished frame of a military officer. Even before the war, before the Flying Tigers, before the Pacific swallowed so many men whole, Boyington lived in conflict with the world around him. Born in 1912 and raised in the rugged northwest of the United States, he grew up wrestling with restlessness, an inner turbulence that seemed to burn hotter than anything the world expected from a young man. Friends said he was brilliant. Teachers said he was undisciplined. His commanders, years later, would say he was both. And Boyington never disagreed. His early Marine Corps years were a cocktail of exceptional flying ability mixed with relentless friction against authority. He believed rules existed for people without talent. The Corps believed discipline existed to keep men alive. This was the first of many collisions. Yet through it all, one thing remained clear. Boyington could fly an aircraft in ways that made even seasoned pilots shake their heads. He wasn't reckless, at least not in the air. He was aggressive, intuitive, and utterly fearless. The kind of pilot who instinctively understood that combat flying was not about precision alone. It was about willpower, about who broke first. His life took a sharp, controversial turn when he joined the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, in China. Here he learned lessons that would scar him and shape him in equal measure. How to fight a superior enemy with inferior tools, how to lead men through pure force of personality, and how to survive when every advantage belonged to someone else. It was in the skies over Burma and China that Boyington learned the art of kill-or-die flying, the chaotic, brutal, instinct-driven style that would later define VMF 214. But his time with the Tigers deepened the cracks in his life. Money disputes, drinking, and arguments tore apart relationships with fellow pilots and commanders. When he returned to the U.S. Marines, the Corps saw a man with combat experience, yes, but also a man with volatility simmering beneath the skin. His record was stained, his temper was legend, and his reputation made promotion unlikely. Yet war has a way of turning misfits into weapons. And by 1943, the Pacific was desperate for exactly that kind of weapon. When the decision came to form a new squadron from scattered replacements, Boyington saw his chance. Not for glory, but for redemption. He had lived long enough with the taste of failure, long enough with the suspicion that he might be wasting the last years where he could make any real difference. Commanders hesitated. Some argued he was too unstable. Others believed he was the only man capable of molding an underdog unit into something deadly. In the end, need outweighed caution. Boyington was promoted and handed command of a squadron nobody else wanted. As Boyington walked into the encampment that would become the home of VMF 214, the pilots immediately sensed something different about him. He did not move like other officers. He didn't bark orders to prove authority. His presence radiated a strange mix of confidence, fatigue, and simmering intensity. He looked like a man who had seen too much and was prepared to see more. Where other commanders spoke of tactics, Boyington spoke of survival. Where others warned about mistakes, he warned about hesitation. His philosophy, forged in the skies of China, was brutally simple. Hit them fast, hit them hard, hit them before they even see you. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't written in any Marine Corps manual, but to men who were already living with the fear of dying in a flaming cockpit, it made perfect sense. They didn't need poetry. They needed truth. Yet Boyington remained a contradiction. To some pilots, he was inspiring. Finally, a leader who didn't hide behind polished speeches or empty promises. To others, he was unpredictable, too willing to push himself and the squadron toward the edge. His drinking remained a quiet storm in the background, known to the officers, whispered about by the enlisted men. Some wondered if he was unstable. Others argued that only a man who understood chaos could lead them into it. When Boyington first addressed his pilots as a unit, he made no effort to hide their odds. He told them straight. They were outnumbered, they were undertrained, and they had been handed a plane other units didn't want. But he also told them something no pilot in 1943 expected to hear from a commanding officer. They could become the best squadron in the Pacific because no one expected anything from them. No pressure, no legacy, no shadows of fallen heroes to stand under. They were free to become something entirely new. And that belief, it spread. Slowly at first, like a rumor. Then with the force of a rising tide. What Boyington saw in them was what he saw in himself. Men the system had doubted. Men shaped by hardship, anger, and resilience. Men with something to prove. Under his command, they weren't just pilots. They were fighters with teeth, a pack. He pushed them mercilessly in the air. Formation discipline, diving attacks, high G turns, rapid climbs that made weaker pilots nearly black out. He studied each man, found his strengths and weaknesses, and then dragged them up to the standard he needed, not because he wanted medals, but because he knew any gap in skill could get them killed when the real fighting began. At night, when the engines cooled and the airfield fell into uneasy darkness, Boyington became something else, a man wrestling with his own ghosts. He drank to push down the memories of China, the friends he lost, the mistakes he made, the promises he broke. War did not create Boyington. It only illuminated the battle he had always been fighting inside. But the irony of Boyington's leadership was this. His personal flaws made him precisely the leader VMF 214 needed. He didn't try to be perfect, so his men didn't feel pressured to pretend either. He didn't hide his scars, so his pilots weren't ashamed of theirs. In a war defined by polished reports and clean-cut propaganda, Boyington gave them something real, a commander who bled, cursed, laughed, and fought exactly as they did. When the men of VMF 214 looked at Boyington, they didn't see a flawless military hero. They saw a reflection of themselves, raw, imperfect, determined. And that connection, that shared defiance, would become the backbone of their legend. Now all that remained was the proving ground. Boyington had the men had their commander, and the Pacific skies were waiting. With Boyington in command and a squadron forged from men the Marines had nearly written off, the Black Sheep were now ready to confront the machines, the missions, and the brutal learning curve that would shape them into a lethal force. The first time the men of VMF 214 stood beneath the F4U Corsair, most felt a mix of awe and unease. The aircraft towered above them, its wingtips curling like talons, its massive nose stretching forward with predatory intent. It didn't look like something built for human beings. It looked like something built to conquer them, The Navy had already rejected it for carrier use, calling it too dangerous, too unstable, too unpredictable to put on a deck packed with young pilots. The Marine Corps received it because they had no better option. But Boyington saw what others missed: a machine that could intimidate the enemy as much as the man flying it. The Corsair was a beast, 2,000 horsepower of unrefined, explosive muscle. The cockpit sat far back, giving the pilot the visibility of a man trying to peer over a steel barricade. The long nose could hide an entire airplane. On landing, the bird dropped like a stone, bounced unpredictably, and punished even the smallest mistake. Many pilots broke gear struts or ground looped the moment they touched down. Mechanics joked that landing the Corsair required divine intervention. Pilots joked that divine intervention rarely showed up in the Solomons. But when the engine roared and the wings lowered into attack position, the aircraft transformed. It climbed like nothing else, dove like a falling sword, and hit with the force of 6 50-caliber machine guns that could cut a zero in half. To the Black Sheep, the F4U became more than a machine. It became a test. If they could master this unpredictable monster, they believed they could master anything the Japanese threw at them. Boyington understood this psychological power, and he leaned into it. His training flights were brutal, pushing pilots into high G turns until they felt their vision narrow to a tunnel of vibrating metal and pounding heartbeat. He forced them to dive steep and pull out at the edge of structural limits, teaching them where the Corsair groaned, where it resisted, and where it unleashed its fury. He made them fire until their fingers numbed, teaching the rhythm of the guns, the recoil patterns, the heat buildup, and the way tracers looked when they connected with something alive in the sky. The ground crews, the silent lifeblood of any squadron, watched it all with quiet pride. These Marines were the forgotten warriors of Pacific aviation, working under conditions that would break most men. Their tools rusted in the humidity. Oil turned to sludge. Rubber rotted in the sun. Spare parts arrived late, damaged or not at all. They cannibalized wrecks, invented fixes, and improvised solutions without manuals. Night after night, they kept the Corsairs alive, often with no guarantee. The pilot they repaired the plane for would return the next morning. Many said they aged years in months. They slept next to the runway, boots still on, waiting for engines that might never come back. The bond between pilots and mechanics became something deeper than duty. It was a pact forged in fear and trust. Pilots flew as if their lives depended on the crews, because they did. And the crews worked as if the next mission determined the fate of the entire war, because sometimes it felt like it did. Yet even as the Black Sheep adapted to their aircraft, the environment itself pushed them to the brink. The jungle heat crushed lungs. The humidity soaked uniforms instantly. Tropical diseases stalked them like invisible predators. At night, mosquitoes swarmed so thick that pilots joked they could lift a Corsair if they worked together. Malaria wasn't a threat. It was a guarantee. Men woke drenched in sweat, shivering uncontrollably, their bodies trembling from fever. And still, they flew. Fear was always present, lurking beneath the bravado. The new pilots, especially, faced their private demons on nightfall, the knowledge that they might be the next to vanish without a trace. They heard the stories whispered in the tents, pilots who disappeared over the ocean, aircraft that dove into the jungle, men who went missing in clouds thick enough to hide a mountain. Sometimes wrecks were found years later, sometimes never. The Pacific could swallow anything, but fear also sharpened them. It united them. And Boyington, who understood fear better than any man in the unit, used it to harden their spirits. He didn't promise survival. He didn't promise glory. He promised only that if they followed him, they would not die without a fight. To the Black Sheep, that was enough. The first time they flew together as a squadron, something clicked. In the air, their individual quirks blended into a single, aggressive formation. Boyington took point, the squadron behind him, climbing into a sky streaked with the orange of dawn. The engines thundered in synchronized rhythm. For the first time, they looked like a united force. Rough edges, mismatched pasts, broken rules, and all. Boyington watched them from his cockpit mirror, studying each pilot's spacing, responsiveness, and confidence. He noticed who stayed tight, who drifted, who hesitated. He noticed the potential in their movements, the raw, unrefined power of a squadron ready to become something dangerous. When they returned to base, sweat-soaked and exhausted, Boyington didn't congratulate them. He didn't need to. The look in their eyes said everything. They had tasted the sky as a unit, and they wanted more. Day by day, their edges sharpened, their takeoff synchronized, their gunnery tightened, their understanding of the Corsair deepened until the aircraft felt less like a threat and more like an extension of themselves. The once fractured collection of misfits now carried a shared identity, one that surprised even the senior staff officers who watched from the sidelines. What emerged was a squadron with no interest in reputation and no patience for hesitation. A squadron that learned to strike hard, retreat fast, and dominate the air through sheer violence of action. A squadron that no longer cared that others had doubted them, but all the training, all the sweat, all the lessons learned from the Corsair and from Boyington were only preparation. The true test, the one that would etch their name into history, waited beyond the horizon, where Japanese Zeros patrolled the skies over Bougainville and Rabaul. The men of VMF 214 were ready, even if they didn't fully know it yet. The Corsairs were fueled. The pilots were hardened. The mission was coming. Now the Black Sheep would face the moment every fighter squadron fears and hungers for, their first real battles, where skill, courage, and survival collide in the burning skies over the Solomons. The first combat sortie came before dawn, when the air still carried the cool breath of night, and the horizon glowed faintly with the promise of another unforgiving day. The Black Sheep stood by their Corsairs, checking belts of .50 caliber ammunition, adjusting worn parachute straps, and exchanging quiet looks that revealed more truth than any words. They knew the Japanese Zeros were waiting somewhere beyond the clouds, experienced killers who had dominated the Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor. The men of VMF 214 were about to discover whether all their training, all their sweat, all their hidden fear had prepared them for the reality of aerial combat. The engines roared to life in a wave, one after another, until the airfield trembled. The Corsairs taxied forward, their propellers kicking up dust and debris as mechanics jogged beside them, tapping metal, shouting last-minute checks, giving thumbs up with forced smiles. The moment the wheels left the runway, the men felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, that electric clarity that came only when rising toward danger. It didn't take long before Boyington spotted the enemy, dark specks against the sun, gliding with predatory grace. There was something almost serene about the Zeros at a distance, but the Black Sheep knew serenity vanished the moment they closed in. Boyington's voice cracked through the radio, calm but sharpened with instinct. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high, stay tight, wait for my break." The first clash was sudden and violent. The Zeros dove with the sun behind them, a tactic they had perfected since China. Their cannons flashed, streaks of fire slicing through the formation. Two Corsairs peeled away, engines smoking. The air erupted into chaos. Screams over the radio, the metallic hammering of machine guns, and the gut-wrenching moment when pilots realized the training range had not prepared them for the speed, ferocity, or sheer unpredictability of a real dogfight. But Boyington had been here before, and his men followed his lead. He rolled his Corsair into a steep dive, using the aircraft's superior weight to build speed. A Zero tried to follow, but the Corsair dropped faster, pulling away with a howl that vibrated through Boyington's bones. He pulled out low, snapped into a climbing turn, and came up behind the enemy fighter. One burst, a flicker of flames. The Zero spiraled into the ocean. That first kill changed everything. The squadron felt a surge of confidence, a shift in the air, an understanding that they could fight the enemy on equal terms. From there, The Black Sheep attacked with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. Hansen, barely out of training, executed a perfect high-side pass that shredded a zero before the Japanese pilot even saw him. McClurg pulled a tight maneuver that forced an enemy fighter into a stall. Blackburn flew so close to a zero that the two aircraft nearly collided as he fired at point-blank range. But victory carried a cost. When the squadron reformed, 2 Corsairs were missing. No chutes had been seen. No smoke signals in the ocean. Just silence. The men returned to base with triumph pounding in their hearts and grief sinking into their stomachs. Empty bunks greeted them first. Then the realization that tomorrow would bring another mission, another chance to lose someone they had only begun to know. The emotional toll mounted quickly. Some pilots grew quieter, staring at the sky as if trying to memorize it. Others cracked jokes more loudly than before, forcing laughter to drown out the fear. Boyington watched all of it with an expression that never fully softened. He knew the faces of loss too well, but he also watched for something else: resilience. And the Black Sheep had it. Their reputation grew rapidly. Within weeks, the squadron became known for daring, unpredictable attacks. They struck bomber formations, ripping through the enemy lines with coordinated aggression. They escorted dive bombers into territory no other Marine fighter group dared approach. They strafed Japanese airfields, destroying parked aircraft and sending shockwaves through enemy command. What the Japanese first saw as a new, inexperienced unit quickly became a priority threat. Enemy intelligence began tracking them by name. Boyington's squadron, some called them. The Bent-Wing Devils, others said. The Black Sheep insignia, painted on the Corsairs in rough, hurried strokes, became a symbol the enemy learned to fear. The missions grew more dangerous as their success drew attention. Rabaul, the heavily fortified Japanese stronghold, became the ultimate proving ground. Flying near Rabaul was like stepping into the mouth of a volcano. Volcanic ash clouds, thick anti-aircraft fire, and waves of enemy fighters rising from hidden airstrips. The Black Sheep went anyway. On one mission, Boyington led his men deep into enemy territory, pushing the Corsairs to their limits. They dove on a formation of bombers, tearing the sky apart with gunfire. But the retaliation came instantly. Swarms of Zeros swept in, their engines shrieking. The dogfight became a blur of violent turns, desperate dives, and split-second decisions. Hansen scored 2 kills before his engine began trailing black smoke. McClurg saved him by diving between Hansen's crippled Corsair and a Zero moving in for the kill, firing in a tight burst that sent the Japanese fighter exploding into fragments. But not every story ended with a heroic save. The Black Sheep suffered losses that tore at their hearts. Pilots they had laughed with the night before vanished in flashes of fire or plumes of ocean spray. Sometimes they found wreckage days later, twisted and burned. Sometimes they found nothing. The war had no mercy, and the Solomons gave none either. Boyington carried these losses heavier than he showed. At night, he walked alone near the edge of the airfield, staring at the black horizon as if trying to bargain with the ghosts that lingered there. He hid it from the men, masking sorrow with toughness, because he knew the squadron needed strength more than sympathy. But despite the hardship, something extraordinary happened. The Black Sheep began to win consistently, against superior numbers, against unfavorable odds, against an enemy that had held air dominance for too long. Victory after victory built a momentum that felt unstoppable. Their kill counts rose. Their missions succeeded. Their confidence hardened into something fierce and undeniable. The legend was forming, and everyone knew it, even the men themselves. They could feel it in the way other units looked at them, in the uneasy respect from command, in the quiet conversations among mechanics who now spoke of the Black Sheep with pride instead of doubt. The misfit squadron had become a force to be reckoned with. Now, with each mission pushing them deeper into danger, the Black Sheep stood on the edge of their greatest triumphs and their greatest losses. The stakes were rising, and fate was waiting. But every ascent reaches its peak, And for the Black Sheep, the final chapter would come with sacrifice, disappearance, and a legacy shaped not only by victory, but by the cost of reaching it. The final phase of the Black Sheep story unfolded not with triumph, but with an uneasy sense of inevitability. Success had elevated them into legend, but it had also painted a target on their backs. By late 1943, the squadron had flown mission after mission, with a pace so relentless that even the strongest men felt the edges of exhaustion cutting into them. Their bodies ached, their nerves frayed, and their eyes, once sharp with adrenaline, now carried the shadows of too many dogfights, too many empty seats at dinner, too many names carved into memory because there was nowhere left to carve them physically. Pappy Boyington felt it most. His kill count had risen to a level that drew attention from high command, from other squadrons, and even from the Japanese themselves. Tokyo Rose, the infamous propagandist, began mentioning him by name on radio broadcasts, claiming the Japanese would soon bring him down. The men pretended to laugh it off, but the truth was undeniable. Boyington had become too successful to survive for long, yet he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Something inside him, a mix of pride, fury, and the relentless drive to prove himself, pushed him to fly more, fight more, risk more. His missions grew bolder. Deeper sorties into Japanese-held territory, closer strafing runs, more aggressive dogfights. Command tried to pull him back, but Boyington always found a way to get airborne. The war inside him had never been about orders. It was about redemption. And redemption didn't allow rest. The squadron mirrored his energy, an energy that burned bright and dangerously. They had become the Marine Corps' most talked-about unit, the embodiment of determination in a brutal air war. Newspapers back home printed stories about their victories, their kill totals, their daring missions. Photographs of the Black Sheep standing beside their Corsairs, covered in sweat and grime, turned them into symbols of American resilience. But those headlines never captured what the men actually felt, the creeping sense that their luck was running out. Then came the day Boyington flew his final mission. It began like so many others, with the engines rumbling across the airfield and the Black Sheep forming up under a sky tinted with early morning gold. Boyington led a group of nearly 24 aircraft on a deep penetration mission near Rabaul. It was the heart of Japanese air power in the South Pacific. A hornet's nest so deadly, it had swallowed dozens of Allied planes for everyone that escaped. The moment they neared Rabaul, the sky erupted. Zeros poured upward in swarms. Anti-aircraft fire carved black blossoms through the clouds. Amid the chaos, Boyington darted through enemy formations like a man possessed, firing in short, lethal bursts. He claimed several kills that day. But then, in the density of smoke, ash, and twisting metal, something happened, something no one fully saw. One moment he was there, a dark silhouette against the burning skyline. The next, he was gone. Corsairs searched for him. Radios crackled with desperate calls. Pilots scanned the ocean for a chute, a splash, a piece of wreckage. Anything. Nothing. The Pacific had swallowed Pappy Boyington whole. The squadron returned, to base with a silence that felt like a wound. Mechanics looked behind the returning planes, waiting to see Boyington slide out of his cockpit with that exhausted half-smile he always wore. But the space where his Corsair should have been remained tragically empty. For days, then weeks, the Black Sheep tried to hold themselves together. They flew missions, but their edge dulled. Their formations loosened. The fierce, dangerous unity they once had faltered beneath the weight of grief. Boyington had been more than a commander. He was the dark heart of their identity, the flawed, relentless force that turned misfits into warriors. Without him, everything felt different. Eventually, command rotated the squadron out. Their combat tour had been short, brutal, and unforgettable. They left the Solomons not as the uncertain group of replacements who had arrived, but as a legendary squadron with one of the highest kill ratios in Marine Corps history. But that legend carried a cost measured in blood, shattered aircraft, and memories that would haunt them long after the war ended. Boyington, as the world later learned, had not died. He had been captured by the Japanese and thrown into a prisoner of war camp. There he endured starvation, beatings, and months of isolation. He didn't know whether the Black Sheep still existed. He didn't know if his men had survived. He fought a new kind of battle now, one without airplanes, one without escape routes, one where the enemy controlled every breath he took. When the war finally ended, Boyington emerged gaunt, scarred, and changed. But he was alive. And in the chaos of celebration, he learned the truth. The Black Sheep had not only endured after his disappearance, they had carried his legacy forward, telling stories of his leadership, his ruthlessness, his fierce loyalty, and the strange combination of chaos and discipline that had bonded them. Their reunion, years later, was emotional. Not polished or ceremonial, but raw and honest. Like everything about the Black Sheep, they remembered the victories. They remembered the losses. They remembered how close they came to breaking. And they remembered how they held on, because Boyington had taught them to fight until the sky itself surrendered. The legacy of the Black Sheep Squadron didn't come from perfect discipline or flawless execution. It came from something deeper, the willingness of flawed men to rise together, to fight as one, to define themselves not by what they lacked, but by what they dared to become. They were proof that even in a war of machines and strategy, the human spirit, scarred, stubborn, unrefined, could still carve its name into history. Their story has lived on for decades because it embodies everything the Pacific War demanded. Courage against impossible odds, brotherhood forged in violence, leadership rising from broken places, and the unshakable belief that even the underestimated can become extraordinary. The Black Sheep were not born legends. They became legends because the Pacific tried to break them and failed. Their legend endures because it rose from blood, chaos, courage, and the unyielding will of men who refused to fall, even as the Pacific tried to swallow them whole.